within the strengthening fellowship of friends and family, to praise God for the life of Hudson Topping, to share our grief with God and with one another, to reaffirm our faith in God's unfailing goodness, to hear again God's promise of resurrection, and to commend Hudson to God's everlasting care. I'd like to invite the family, Carol and Chuck and Scott, to come forward to say a few words at this moment, at this time.
We'd like to say thank you to everybody for coming today.
See so many of my dad's friends here. Faces that we haven't seen in a while. It's cool.
Some we've never met. We wanted to say thank you for being with my dad and my mom. Affectionately called Fart Whirlwind. Yes, that's amazing.
And I love every one of you. Thank you.
Will you pray with me? Gracious God, your steadfast love endures forever, your faithfulness to all generations. Trustworthy in all your words and gracious in all of your deeds, minister now to us in our grief. Speak to our hearts your word of comfort. Touch us into hope through the promises of resurrection. Enfold us within the fellowship of all who share our sorrow. Fill us with the joy and peace that comes from above. It is in this moment of stillness and quietness and peace that we wait upon you. Amen. Hear the words of the psalmist David when he writes what he writes in Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the right paths for his name's sake. And even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long. I sat in my office one day, tucked away in this upper room, just to my right, still getting settled in, having only been at First Christian Church a handful of months, when in came Hudson and Mary. They sat down and we chatted. Hudson, it was the funniest thing. The first thing that we chatted about, Hudson said, I have this chair at my house that I think that you need in your office. Now, mind you, it was the first time he'd ever stepped foot in my office, and he had already had plans for this chair, and I said, sounds good, when do you want to bring it by? And he said, hold on a minute. And he left my office, and it was sitting right around my corner. And we continued our conversation. It wasn't a conversation about our shared Hoosier heritage, although those conversations would happen much later. I'm still not convinced that he really was from Indiana. His accent didn't say it. Northern Indiana. But it was a conversation that we shared, a conversation of humility and love and generosity. And he and Mary beamed. They had just heard about a new initiative that had just started with Week of Compassion, the Relief, Refugee, and Development Fund of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. Week of Compassion works to equip and empower disciples all over the world to alleviate the suffering of others through disaster response, humanitarian aid, and sustainable development. And so it was that Hudson and Mary, feeling compelled by the work of Week of Compassion and their longtime relationship with Week of Compassion's past executive director and my good friend and mentor, Johnny Ray, Johnny was actually Mary's minister in Oak Ridge, that Hudson pulled out his checkbook and he said, "We want to do this." Mary echoed his same excitement with only plans to how to get the funds to Indianapolis and Week of Compassion's office. Being the remaining of the conversation, Hudson quickly turned the conversation by saying, "We want this to be anonymous." To date, that gift, along with other subsequent gifts from Hudson and Mary, the congregation of FCC, and the congregation of First Christian Church, we have provided in upwards of $50,000 to Week of Compassion. Now, that later would be added by another gift that was sparked, a memorial gift of $25,000. So because of Hudson and Mary's initial gift, First Christian Church is now, along with another gift, in upwards of $75,000 to Week of Compassion. And Hudson and Mary, Hudson was a seed planter of all that. And in many ways, he was the good shepherd, offering care and encouraging others to live with compassion and love and generosity. This gentle and good shepherd didn't care that it was him that was promoting others to live out their faith. He didn't care that his name, he didn't want a badge. In fact, he would have vehemently declined that badge. He didn't want the "I've put my faith and compassion into action" badge. Because of Hudson, thousands of people all over the world have known and will know God's compassion, generosity, and love because of Hudson's compassion, generosity, and love. Now, the figures aren't important. I've never seen Hudson angry. I have seen him frustrated, sure, but angry, I cannot picture it. Should I be able to picture that? No. I'm looking at the 3 children. And if I told you the amount, I would not be honoring him as he wished. But I can tell you that his ability to do such a generous thing might seem as a product as of a successful man. Typically, we think of such a generous act as something someone is able to do only after having become successful. But let me tell you that Hudson was successful, not because he could do such a generous thing, but because he did do such a generous thing. It didn't take success to spark Hudson to act. And in nearly every way, he lived as Ralph Waldo Emerson redefined definition of success. Emerson says this. He says that man is a success who lived well, who laughed often and loved much, who has gained the respect of intelligent men and the love of children, who has filled his niche with and accomplished his task, who leaves the world better than he found it, whether by an improved copy or a perfect poem or a rescued soul, who never lacked appreciation of earth's beauty or failed to express it, who looked for the best in others and gave the very best he had. Indeed, Hudson Topping did give the best he had. And goodness and mercy, you guessed that, they have followed him all the days of his life. And I'm sure, at least I hope I can say with certainty, that he knew that. And it follows Hudson even now. And goodness and mercy will continue to follow him, and it will be felt. Friends, Hudson showed us what mattered most in life: goodness and mercy, and allowing the magnificent light of God's light, of God's unconditional love, to disperse the shadows of the valley. As it turns out, That is where the shepherd leads us, into the realm of goodness and mercy and living as beacons of God's unconditional love. And so, as we feel the void in our hearts, the shadows of the valleys that the psalmist talks about, as we bid farewell to Hudson's earthly presence, we give thanks to God for giving us the gift of Hudson. We celebrate and proclaim the good news of the resurrection and the recalling of our memories of Hudson. For Hudson's presence has been etched into our hearts and our memories, his mark left on us and the world. Today is a celebration of one well-lived life, the culmination of a life rooted in humility, compassion, generosity, and love. And so let us celebrate, not mourn for our loss, but celebrate the resurrection that Hudson knows and spend his life sharing with others. And may Hudson's life inspire us, reminding us what matters most in life is to live within and into the depths of God's service. As the great writer Wendell Berry once wrote, "Every day you have less of a reason to give, not to give yourself away." May the shepherd continue to lead us beside still waters, just as God did with Hudson. And may our memories of Hudson remind us and inspire us to give ourselves away in compassion and love, and that in giving ourselves away, goodness and mercy will follow us our whole life long as well. Indeed, Hudson did leave the world much better place than I'm sure he found it. And Hudson invites us to follow him and to do the same. Amen. I want to invite you to find hymn number 86 in your
I wish I could say that I had known Hudson Topping my entire life, but unfortunately that wouldn't be true. When I first met him almost 20 years ago, he had already lived a full life, serving in the U.S. Navy, raising 3 fine children, suffering through the loss of his first wife. We only met and became friends when he joined the Never Everest tennis group soon after that. For those of you who don't know what the Never Everest is, I should explain. It's a group of about 60 seniors, most over about 60 years of age, who meet a couple of times each week to play doubles tennis. It's a social group. No one expects to move on to the pro tournaments from Never Everest, so everyone just plays for the fun of the game. In their version of doubles tennis, players also rotate positions so that they play against and with almost everybody in the group. And because of that social mingling, Hudson eventually found a kindred spirit in Mary Bennett. After a year or so, they made a decision to share their lives and were married. When Hudson got Mary his wife, he also got my wife Betty and me as firm friends. That's because Mary had already been our dear friend and a part of our life for almost 30 years. Hudson very quickly also became not only a friend, but a part of our life too. I don't think I have ever met a kinder, more gentle man than Hudson Topping. He was polite to a fault, and I doubt that he ever met anyone he didn't immediately become friends with. He could strike up a conversation with a complete stranger, and within minutes they were more than an acquaintance. I have never heard him speak ill of another person, nor show anger over a situation, though some here in the Never Everest probably would disagree with that when they think about the serves he fouled or the returns he missed on the tennis court. When he missed a shot, Betty says she could still hear his cry of "Mary" echo across the courts in that plain voice, as if Mary could rush in and help him out of his plight. But he always laughed at his mistakes afterwards and soldiered on. I've also never seen a more energetic man, a man who never showed his age. One Thanksgiving, when we had invited Mary and Hudson over along with family and some other friends, our young grandson, who was 5 or 6 at the time, came bursting in the front door, yelling, "There's an old white-haired man out here playing with the kids." I went running to the door, afraid of what I would find, but there was Hudson on the front lawn playing soccer with the children, and both he and they were having a grand time. He was always involved in something, anything. He worked tirelessly for his church, mowing grass, changing light bulbs, doing other maintenance work on the building, and even pestering his friends for their aluminum cans to sell for the church so that there would be extra money. He also spent countless hours working on the grounds at his home, mowing, cutting brush, and even trees, and maintaining his 2 fish ponds. He loved feeding the fish and the occasional duck in those ponds, and he and Mary often took chairs down to sit beside them and toss breadcrumbs into the water. Hudson was a wood carver, even carving a full-size totem pole to grace the front drive of his house, and he carved many other smaller gifts for his children. He loved his children and often talked to Carol, Chuck, Scott, and George and what they were doing. Those of us who were close to him felt we were also close to them. One of Mary's hobbies was watercolor painting, and Hudson was thrilled each time she finished a painting. He insisted on framing and hanging it in the house, and whenever visitors came, they were ushered around while he proudly showed off her work. He was a supportive husband. He was also supportive of her in other, more important ways. When Mary developed Alzheimer's, Hudson was at her side every moment, attending and caring, rarely taking a break, usually only when friends insisted, and offered to take his place for an hour or 2. He was the man who took his marriage vows very seriously. He was a voracious reader, and when not doing something else, always had a book in his hand. He loved the Patrick O'Brian series of books set in the Napoleonic Wars that told the story of Jack Aubrey and the British Royal Navy and the naval surgeon Stephen Maturin. Mary bought every book in the 20-novel series for him, and knowing that I also liked them, he passed them on to me as soon as he finished each one. When I found a copy of one of the novels on Books on Tape, I gave it to him, but because it was out of sequence, he gave it back. He didn't want to hurt Mary's feelings by not letting her buy it for him. That was the kind of guy he was. When he was at Adria Weston, Betty and I took him magazines, and when we asked what he liked, he said to bring him anything because there were others at Adria who would read them. That too was the kind of guy Hudson was. After looking through a few of the food magazines that Betty later gave him, he said he would give them to a chef at Adria. I think he had his eye on the pie recipes in them. He loved his sweets. He had to have a package of cookies nearby at all times. In fact, when grocery shopping, selecting the cookies was his first priority. Selecting the beer was his second priority. When he made the decision to leave his home, I'm sure he chose Adria because when he first went there on an inspection visit, he found a plate of cookies inside the front door. The fact that they would allow him to keep his beer in his room cinched the deal. But when he came to other food, he would eat anything placed in front of him. I always attributed that to his service in the Navy. In the military, you eat whatever is served or you don't eat at all. Betty and I always shared a condo at Hilton Head with Hudson and Mary when we were there for the annual Never Everest tennis clinics. And Hudson had his routine. He invariably had a sandwich for lunch, then went straight to bed for his 1-hour nap. We knew better than to disturb him, regardless of what other activity might be on the agenda, because the hour between 1 and 2 was officially Hudson's nap time. At Hilton Head, he had a fondness for oysters on the half shell. In fact, I think he and I were probably the only 2 in the rather large group who liked them, and we always looked forward to dinners at Marley's so we could have them. I'll miss having those dinners with Hudson. I'll miss our trips out to Seymour just to visit. I'll miss our once each winter fondue dinners that we shared with Mary Ellen and Jimmy. I'll miss our tennis weeks at Hilton Head and the card games that were played in the evenings. But most of all, I would simply miss Hudson. He was an exceptional person. He often joked about the difference in our heights, but in a way that I knew it really didn't bother him. Regardless of that difference, Hudson was a man I could always look up to. Rest in peace, Hudson Topping. You're a good man.
On the 25th of May, I was talking to my good friend, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and we felt a tremor in the force. And we knew that something had happened. One of the Jedi Knights, a true Jedi Knight, Hudson Topping, had gone on to his reward. Now, some of you may not understand what I'm talking about there, but that's a parody on the Star Wars movies. And it's an illustration of the goodness in the world and how one person fits in to the overall community of good works. Hudson, first time I met him, I heard noise. I walked in this room, and he was hollering up to a hole in the roof to someone. Frank was up there in the attic, and he and Hudson were repairing one of the light bulbs. And if you've ever tried to holler through a hole and holler back through a hole, the communication wasn't excellent. So it took him a while to get the light down, the light bulb changed, and sucked back up there. But that reminded me of Hudson's support for this church. He was always down here mowing grass, spreading sod, hammering, doing something in the building. He and Frank were like a team. They were a little younger than they are now, but weren't we all? We first met Mary and Hudson when we were invited to come to this church by the pastor in Oak Ridge. He said, there's a couple in South Knoxville that go to that church in Knoxville that you need to meet. I think the next day we got a phone call. And we were invited to come to this church. And we came and got to the door, and there was Mary and Hudson to welcome us, bring us in, introduce us around to people. And from then on, we were fast friends. Eventually, I became the treasurer, and Mary was my assistant. So again, we were close because every Sunday afternoon, I would go out to Hudson's and Mary's house, and we would spread all the offerings from the Sunday on the table, do all the counting, do all the bookkeeping, while Hudson kept us supplied with coffee. That's another thing I remember. Hudson was never without a coffee cup. And you know how you spell Hudson in 6 letters? Energy. If anyone can be defined as energetic, it was that young man. And I think part of it might have been the amount of coffee he drank. We would go out to Aubrey's or the Chop House, and he would instantly order coffee, and it was probably going to be refilled 3 or 4 times before we finished our meal. There's another illustration of Hudson that I recall. When I first went to their house, his house had an extreme slope next to the driveway, and it was planted with various things. And there was the mountain goat known as Hudson going up and down that hill on all 4s practically. at a speed I couldn't believe because I had a hard time just walking up the driveway. He was so resilient, I never knew how old he was because I felt he was a peer of mine. Then I found out he was a Korean War vet and some years older than I. During his Korean War service, he toughed it out, he was in Corpus Christi, Texas, and down in Mississippi, and eventually made it to Guam. My wife liked to talk to Hudson because he was the only person she ever met that lived on the island like she did. We're not sure of the time overlap. I've forgotten. He probably told us, but they both experienced the early days in Guam out there with Quonset huts and the snails and the geckos and the big snakes. I want to keep this short. I had a whole, epistle, but rather than go much further, I would just like to say it was a privilege and a pleasure to know Hudson for these last 12 or 13 years. It was always Mary and Hudson. I thought they were joined at the hip practically because, he was always with her when she was doing things, especially when she got ill. I do have a hole in my heart, as I'm sure many of you do. It'll take some time for that to close. Actually, I hope it never does. Hudson was one of my favorite people here. And when you get to be a real senior citizen, when you look around and many or more than of your old friends are not there anymore than they are there. And one can say, well, I'm going to be the last. But that to be the last one is not the way to be either necessarily. So for Hudson, the hospitalman, the Navy veteran, I say, fair skies and following seas, Navy vet.
Bob and John, thank you for your remembrances. We all have stories. You all have stories of Hudson. Hudson has impacted your lives. And so tell those stories, remember those memories, for every time we remember Hudson, he's not really gone, he's still with us. He is still here. Will you pray with me? O God, our strength and our Redeemer, giver of life and conqueror of death, we owe both our minds to one another, leaves us aching as ties are broken. So we ask that you would accept our tears as emblems of devotion, and that you might transform them into waters of life to nourish us in the days ahead. We know in Christ that your love is everlasting and unconditional. We know that nothing can separate any of us from your abiding care. So within the fellowship of the saints, we join ourselves together with the great host of all times and places who celebrate your eternal love. And we add our voices to theirs in giving you unbroken praise. With confidence, we entrust Hudson to your unfailing love and overflowing goodness. Through the power that raised Christ from the dead to live eternally with you, lift up Hudson to life fulfilled beyond our imagining, and accept him as the child of God that he is. Enfold him in your everlasting arms, embrace him as your friend. And now strengthen us through the gift of your Spirit to face into the future with confidence that you stand with us. Grant that the changes of life may leave us stronger as we journey through life together. Reassured of your abiding presence, help us to knit more firmly the ties that bind us one to another. Renewed by your love, help us to love in ever larger circles so as to embrace your people everywhere until at last we are all united eternally. In the name of our Sustainer and Redeemer, we pray. Amen. It is grace abundant, grace amazing, amazing grace that Hudson lived. He felt it and he gave it. Let us sing of that grace, the grace which we all know if we just look hard enough. Amazing Grace, in number 546. Will you stand as you read? Take courage. Know in the knowledge that the loving God is your eternal friend and companion. And may the peace of God, which is beyond our understanding, guard your hearts and your thoughts. Go in peace.